Hello, my name is Mackenzie Mirre Tabeling. I'm a current master's student at East Carolina University in the program of Maritime Studies. Today I'm going to be presenting on a small portion of my research for my thesis. This portion of the research seeks to analyze the maritime taskscape, or water-based tasks of a specific enslaved community in northeastern North Carolina. We're just going to look at the general relationships between white slave owners and the enslaved people labeled as their property. Somerset Place might seem like a strange setting for a maritime study since it's not underwater, not submerged, but the functionality of the plantation was dependent upon the seasonal patterns and states of the bodies of water surrounding it. Those included Lake Phelps, the Scuppernong River, and the Albemarle Sound. Both the white slave owners and the enslaved community culturally and physically shaped the maritime landscape of the area and depend on these maritime bodies to interact with the outside world. To give a brief history of Somerset Place for context, Somerset Place is located on the north shore of Lake Phelps, also known as Lake Scuppernong in some cases. It was first utilized by various tribes of Native Americans in North Carolina and then later developed by European colonists settling in the Virginia-Carolina wilderness. In 1784, three Edenton businessmen decided to start developing their own sector of a newly independent American economy. Josiah Collins, Nathaniel Allen, and Samuel Dickinson established the Lake Company with the goal to develop a rice plantation on the swampy environment around Lake Phelps. In alignment with the other common agricultural practices in similar areas, the members of the Lake Company planned a canal and irrigation system to maintain the wild land. The members of the Lake Company believed that West Africans were specifically suited to work in a swampy ecosystem. This seemed most profitable and effective to purchase enslaved Africans directly from the continent because neighboring plantation owners would not hire their enslaved property to work on canals just because of the dangerous implications. Josiah Collins eventually started to buy out his partners in 1790 and became the sole and primary owner of the Lake Company land and the enslaved property which came with it. Under his sight, the 6-mile canal, which you see on the screen, was completed, connecting Lake Phelps to the Scuppernong River near the town of Columbia. However, Collins was not a hands-on plantation owner. In fact, he spent most of his time at his homestead in Edenton. He left the labor supervision to hired and usually white overseers and conducted trade to and from Somerset through correspondence with the overseers and other merchants. In 1819, Josiah Collins II inherited most of the land from his father, and instead of legally owning it, he was the caretaker until his children were able to inherit the property. The second Collins built up his business ventures, mostly building from his father's businesses, but he began a silk farm near the Alligator River, which didn't last very long. And he developed relationships between the ropewalk indicated on the top image on this slide. He developed a strong relationship with the United States Navy in the War of 1812 and made it pretty well known. In 1830, Josiah Collins III moved to Somerset Plantation right after graduating college and getting married. He is arguably the most hands-on in the daily lives of the enslaved community at Somerset Plantation. The third Josiah's behavior fell in line with many Southern antebellum white slave owners, and he displayed a number of the paternalistic qualities so common at this time. Many white Southerners, particularly slave owners and pro-slavery thinkers, believed that Black people were fundamentally less than human. Many white slave owners believed it was their human duty to oversee the daily lives of the enslaved and ensure that they were well kept. Josiah III displayed this in his weekly practice of reading stories from his porch to both his family and to the enslaved community, his constant presence and leadership in the religious teachings of the Lake Chapel, and even the placement of his home overlooking the slave cabins, as many of the rooms that he would have spent his time in looked directly there. The three Collins generations held unique views towards the establishment of slavery and towards the enslaved community considered as their legal property. Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed from Harvard Law School discusses the concept of the patriarchal and paternal slave owner in her works and explains the three distinct phases within the boundaries and generations of Thomas Jefferson's family. These generations somewhat align with the Collins experience and may provide another point of reference. The first generation of slave owners, or the 17th-century slave owners, understood slavery as an amoral system which caused conflict between races. Thomas Jefferson and Josiah Collins the Elder, the 18th-century generation, maintained the idea that slavery served as an evil necessary for the function of nation building. This generation believed that the development of enlightened thinking would eventually lead to the end of slavery. But by the 19th century, or Thomas Jefferson's son, or Josiah Collins' third generation, the general attitude towards slavery was that the entire community of the plantation, including both the white owners and the enslaved, were part of one family in which the plantation owner served as the role of a father. To explain this concept of taskscape can be a little confusing. The term was first coined by Tim Ingold in 1990, and he describes a taskscape as a performance similar to a musician performing. Taskscape analyzes the physical and cultural environment as products of the human and non-human activity within their temporary time which they are occupying the environment. Ingold uses this painting entitled The Harvesters by Peter Bruegel, I think I'm saying that right, to illustrate the description of a taskscape. He invites the viewer to imagine themselves within the painting, to see the past and the roads, to hear the sounds and smell the smells. He wants the reader to look at the paths and the roads as the patterns of human movement, or to understand how the tree is a social space, or how it's gotten its meaning. Ingold uses the corn to signify how the human and non-human actors impact each other. So for instance, as the corn grows and is ready to harvest, it impacts the tasks undertaken by the workers, and as the workers accomplish their tasks, the form and meaning of the corn changes. So a plantation dependent on enslaved labor proves to be a very particular form of taskscape, as the taskscape is a measure of the assigned and voluntary tasks undertaken. As the bodies of water surrounding the plantation change with the season, they take on an alternate meaning and require various tasks from the labor force. Somerset Plantation and its inhabitants, again, were completely dependent on the canals, the lake, the river, and the sound for transportation and contact with the world outside of the plantation. These water bodies communicate the patterns of movement and thus the values of those living and working at Somerset Plantation, as well as the other Collins properties. Additionally, spaces were given meaning based on assigned tasks or the lack thereof. For example, the small number of plantation-specific tasks associated with Lake Phelps allowed the lake to gain meaning as a place of privacy and ritual for the enslaved community, as they usually bathed there in the waters right outside their cabin doors. So the unique ways in which Collins plantation owners view themselves within the context of slavery directly impacted the ideas surrounding the tasks, physical, and cultural environment of the plantation and the other properties. We can easily see this through the records left by the Collins family, indicating the spaces the enslaved individuals were assigned to carry out their tasks and allowed to do so. So for the sake of time and sanity, we will analyze a very small portion of a taskscape and look at the physical spaces where tasks would have been assigned to the enslaved community under each member of the Collins family. So first, the patriarch, Josiah Collins, maintained a strictly business relationship with the enslaved people purchased by the late company and later for his own property. The tasks assigned to the enslaved labor force under the senior Collins included the digging of the canal, which of course dramatically transformed the maritime landscape of Somerset Plantation. The task of canal digging proved dangerous to the labor force, not only because of the intense labor, but also because of the mosquito-related diseases which the enslaved Africans would not have been accustomed to. Physically intense tasks were somewhat consolidated to Somerset Plantation at the time, while the more domestic tasks were reserved for the enslaved individuals on the properties in Edenton, also leading to a gender divide in the community. And these red markers indicate where the Collins industries would have been. Collins Sr. built housing and dedicated a decent amount of money to purchase and maintain the physical needs of the enslaved community, including the purchases of wheat, molasses, and rum for the meals of the enslaved at Somerset, and the regular hire of a tailor to produce clothes for those working at the plantation. After the building of the canal, Collins also expanded the enslaved community by purchasing other enslaved individuals of both genders and various ages in order to encourage family building on the plantation. So Josiah saw this as both a human need and an economic strategy to keep slaves from running away and producing more enslaved labor. And I think we can agree now that it's just an economic strategy. So the second Josiah Collins teeters on the line between patriarchal and paternal plantation slave owners. The tasks assigned to the enslaved community under Collins Jr. differed mostly at the rope walk in Edenton. The year before the rope walk closed, records indicate that 22 enslaved laborers were assigned tasks related to rope production at the rope walk. With the development of the U.S. Navy again in the War of 1812 and the well-known establishment of the Edenton rope walk, Collins supplied a large portion of rope needed for maritime activities. This space provided avenues to transfer skills to a variety of enslaved individuals. While Collins Jr. did have a business-heavy relationship with Somerset, he did add to the paternal setting of the plantation. Collins built a dwelling house for himself while he was at Somerset, with the intent for it to serve as a home when his son inherited the plantation. Lastly, the paternal Josiah Collins III took a vested and active role in the daily lives and structures of the enslaved community on Somerset Plantation. As we can see from the purple locations, the third Collins accumulated most, if not all, of the enslaved community to a limited space. This could be explained because he inherited only certain property, but also because of his paternal ideologies in personally overseeing the lives of the enslaved. In 1831, the year after the third Josiah Collins took over the family property, Nat Turner led a rebellion not too far away from Somerset Place. So in response to the threat of slave insurrections, Southern plantation owners tightened their direct control over the enslaved people on their property. And Collins also did this. He built a hospital in which he had very close contact with a doctor and oversaw the birth of each individual. The same doctor treated both the enslaved community and the Collins family, just not in the same hospital. Perhaps most characteristically paternal, Collins built a lake chapel, which he attended with his family and oversaw the religious teaching and practices, and at times taught the congregation himself. Collins took a vested interest in the daily task of each enslaved person on the plantation and kept a very detailed log. For example, on the entry for Thursday, January 24th of 1850, 4 men and 6 women carried corn from the upper field to the mills, and 6 men carried wood to the flats. Most of these agricultural tasks included clearing out the irrigation ditches and dry canals for the women and children during certain times of the year, and harvesting timber for the men. In the springtime, a few enslaved, younger male enslaved, would be sent from Somerset and assigned to assist at the fishery at Sandy Point. It was owned by his brother at the time. At this time in the Albemarle Sound, the labor force of the fisheries would have been almost entirely enslaved. The fishery was not necessarily specialized labor, but would require training, which would help later. So the ways in which the plantation owner understood himself within the structure of slavery impacted the tasks assigned to the enslaved individuals, as well as the ways in which they expressed their own agency. The more patriarchal Collins the Elder, on the top, was involved in businesses throughout the region. He assigned tasks to the enslaved community, which allowed them a certain amount of movement and thus probably opportunities for the enslaved individuals to display their agency. Collins Jr., the plantation owner in between ideologies, maintained many of the same businesses and properties. However, he did spend more time at Somerset Plantation overseeing the labor in the fields. And the other extreme owners is the third Collins. Collins makes his homestead at Somerset Place, overseeing most of the enslaved labor force. Additionally, many of the businesses started by his father and grandfather were ended at the time, and those enslaved individuals accumulated into a smaller area. Lastly, at the end of the Collins III, he split the remaining properties, such as the fishery, the tannery, were sold, further separating the enslaved community through inheritance. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, Collins' anxiety about slave insurrection and the result of an attempted poison caused the transfer of many of the younger enslaved individuals to properties in Franklin County, as seen on the far left with the green spot. He hired out some enslaved men to the North Carolina Railroad and then sent some others to a property in Alabama with his sister. I just want to thank you all for listening to my presentation. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Lynn Harris for advising me through this research. A very special thank you to Allison Thurman at the North Carolina State Archives for her help accessing all these sources through a pandemic. And lastly, to the North Carolina Maritime Heritage Council for letting me present today. Thank you.